Welcome to the Social Engineer Podcast. This is episode 221. I'm Chris Hadnaghi, CEO and founder of Social Engineer LLC, the Innocent Lives Foundation, and the Institute for Social Engineering. And I've been hosting this podcast since way back in 2009 when we did podcasts with cans and strings. That's how old I am. And because this is the Doctor is In series, we need a doctor, and that is something I am not. So we have our resident doc here at SECom. Abbie, thanks for joining us on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Chris. I'm Dr. Abbie Maroño. I am a behavioral scientist, the Director of Education at Social Engineer, Professor of Psychology, and an expert in nonverbal communication, trust, and the psychological mechanisms underpinning human decision-making.
You got your PhD right this time.
I did. It's a mouthful.
It is. It's a lot to remember. I mean, I can't remember it, obviously.
That's because you don't have a PhD, Chris.
I don't. Well, I do, and messing up. But, it's just a random one. So before we start our episode, here's a couple housekeeping announcements, especially if you're a practitioner of social engineering and you're interested in finding out how you can up your game, become better. I want to invite you to something that is brand new. We've never done it before. Our master's level social engineering class for the first 7 years we ran it has been invite only for previous students of other classes. But for this year, for the very first time, we are opening it up to the public. So we're inviting anyone who wants to come to a 5-day event. It's a physical red teaming class where we actually do physical break-ins, lock picking, RFID cloning, hacking of every device we can touch. And you are invited to check out social-engineer.com. Go to the master's level social engineering website, and you can see all the other details there. It's in October 23 through 27 here in Orlando, Florida. So everyone is invited. But there's only 16 seats, by the way. So I say everyone's invited, but it's a very small class because it's really intense. We generally go from like 9 a.m. to about 2 a.m. every day because of daytime and nighttime break-ins. So there's a lot going on in there. There's a lot on the website. You can check that out. Also, and I'm sure everyone is aware of this. This is not new news, but every day we turn on the news and something else has got breached or hacked. And if your company is experiencing problems with that, you're trying to figure out how can I get my people more aware of what social engineering is and how these attacks work. And I want to invite you to check out our brand new website, social-engineer.com. Go to the services section and look at how we're helping many companies around the globe be more aware of things like vishing and phishing threats and how your people can become the human firewall that you need to protect from these things. We have a range of services to help you and your employees become more secure, so you can check those out on social-engineer.com. Okay, if you like the topic of social engineering, I want to invite everyone here that's not part of it to join our Slack channel. I think we're over 1,500 people now. Every day there's people in there talking about all different parts of social engineering, the psychology of it, practitioners, phishing, smishing. We even help with pretext. We even have a small group that gets together every couple of weeks and they do some vocal practice sessions. So it's really interesting. We have a job board in there. I think we've had about 10 people. I think it's up to 11 now, maybe, where it found jobs. We have companies that are looking and people are looking. So when they find a good match, they're able to join together. So that's pretty cool. You can find the link in the show notes. And if not, you can hit up Abbie or I on LinkedIn or other social media, and we will get you the link so you can join. And I want to invite everyone now also to check out innocentlivesfoundation.org. Really, really proud of my team over there. If you're not familiar with our mission, we started this organization just about 6 years ago with the goal of helping law enforcement geolocate and find people who are trafficking children and who harm children and create child abuse material. And we're almost at 500 cases now that we've helped with, that we've handed into law enforcement. We worked almost 800, but we've had 500 that ended up with some form of law enforcement around the globe, hopefully apprehending these perpetrators that are hurting children. So we're really proud of the team there, and we have a really big announcement. In September 23rd, we're running our first gala out in Los Angeles and Burbank at a restaurant called The Castaways. It's being hosted by LeVar Burton. I mean, everyone knows that name, right? Reading Rainbow, Geordie LaForge from Star Trek. This guy is awesome, and he's been an advocate for children his whole career. So he's going to be out there with us hosting this event. You can come out there, and if you want to find out more information about how you can support Innocent Lives Foundation, or you want to find out more information about the gala, go to innocentlivesfoundation.org/gala, and you can find all the information there. And last but not least, I want to invite everyone to listen to the best rock and roll band on the planet Earth, Clutch. They're the music for this podcast. If you're listening on iTunes or Spotify, they allow us generously to use their music, as well as they're big supporters of the Innocent Lives Foundation. We love those guys over there and their music. So go check them out at pro-rock.com. Best way to hear them is live. I'm sure they're still touring all over the globe. So just find out a show that's close to you and definitely go. You will not be sorry. I said that was the last thing, but there is one more thing. If you like the content that you hear, we're asking you to hit that like button there, whether you're listening on audio format or you're on YouTube. And if you have any questions or comments, things you'd like to see us talk about, topics, you can leave them right there in the comments, in the notes, either on YouTube or iTunes or Spotify. We do check those. We have a team that reacts to those or that will answer you if you have questions. And we appreciate, of course, the likes and the other comments that come in. So thank you for all of that. Okay, now let's get to our topic. So, Dr. Abbie, what have you chosen for us today?
We are talking today about learned helplessness.
Oof, this is going to be a heavy topic.
Yes.
Yeah, so we talk about this in our foundational application of social engineering class when we get to the manipulation section. But maybe for those who might not really understand what we're talking about, can you define it? What is this that we're talking about?
So learned helplessness is a psychological trait. It results from repeated exposure to uncontrollable and adverse events. So the idea is that an individual will learn to feel helpless, and they feel that they are unable to control or change their circumstances, even when an opportunity to change or escape becomes present.
This is an interesting topic because I know, especially with working with the ILF, that sometimes you can hear. I've even heard law enforcement agents say this: like kids that are being trafficked, they have a modicum of freedom, right? They may have times where their abusers aren't present, and they think, why did they not run away? Yeah. And you can hear. I've heard it said before, like what was wrong with them? Why didn't they just get out when they could? Why don't they get out when they could?
Well, it kind of goes back. Let's explain where the theory came from. And then we can kind of get into that just to give people a bit of a background. So the theory was proposed by Martin Seligman, and most people are probably familiar with this experiment, even if you're not familiar with the idea of learned helplessness. In the experiment, dogs were exposed to electric shocks, and they weren't allowed to escape or avoid the shocks. They couldn't get out. And then over time, after being repeatedly shocked, when given the opportunity to escape, they learned helplessness. They didn't escape even when given the opportunity. And that's kind of the idea. And as Chris said, we see this in humans. The idea of learned helplessness in humans is very well documented. And the effects are dependent on the uncontrollability of the stressor. So, for example, we go back to your example of trafficking. At that point in time, they could escape. But for that learned helplessness to have occurred, there's got to have been multiple occasions when they had an inability to escape that threat. And they probably tried to or observed someone trying to, or were given a situation, say, if you try to, this is going to happen. And then they were unable to. And then there was a threat to life or a threat to harm. So eventually they learn that they can't escape. So when given the opportunity, they don't. And a common area of research for this is abusive relationships.
If I remember correctly, in that study, tell me if I'm remembering a different one. At some point, after they had been tortured for weeks or a lengthy period of time, they started to remove the restraints from the dog, so they actually could have escaped. Yeah. That at one point there was nothing holding them back. Like there was just a pad with the electric shock devices, and there was nothing holding them there at all. And the dog still didn't run away from being electrocuted.
Yeah. And that final, now they have the ability to escape, but they don't. That is the learned helplessness. Yeah. That's where now they can escape, but they won't, because they've learned that they can't, even though they can, because of their previous experiences when they were unable to.
It's such a disturbing study, but it's pivotal to understanding. I think it's easy for people who might not understand this to look at an abused woman or something and say, why do you not run away when he's at work?
Yeah.
Why do you come back when he's there? And that kind of thinking puts the blame on the victim, as opposed to understanding there is a real psychological reason why someone who's being abused might not leave.
And that's what we think. We think, well, why don't you? Why didn't the dogs escape? Because if we think about it rationally, we're like, well, you tried to escape, you couldn't, so you didn't. Now you can, so you should. Yeah. But it's not that simple, because after those repeated attempts to escape, or that repeated evidence of an inability to escape or control a situation, it leads to feelings of submissiveness, and it leads to a reluctance to leave as well. So why didn't they just leave the relationship? Well, because those previous experiences led to an association now of a negative outcome. They now have a reduction in an association with a positive outcome. So they have this decreased ability to see a positive outcome and an increased ability to see a negative outcome. And they believe that the recurrent violence is going to occur either way. So what's the point in fighting it? If I try and escape, that bad thing's going to happen again. So why would I fight it? I'll just let it happen, because if I fight it, it's going to be worse. And you can understand that methodology, that you can understand that thinking because of what they've previously been exposed to.
Is there a link also to that in that study, that those abusers, the people doing the research, they were also the ones who cared for the dogs, like fed them, gave them water, so that after they were done being tortured, these same people might have lovingly taken them back to a place where they now had care.
Yeah, and that's the most worrying thing, that most of the time we learn helplessness by people that we care about. Not always, for example, in the trafficking example, but when we look at the two groups that are most at risk of developing learned helplessness, it's battered women, which is the academic term for women that are being abused by a partner, and abused children. They are the two most vulnerable groups. And when we think about these two groups, it makes sense, because they're rooted in a lack of control. And learned helplessness is rooted in a lack of control. I can't control what happens to me. I can't control my situation. And if you are a woman, your partner, it's most likely to be a man statistically in terms of learned helplessness. Men are much bigger and stronger and overpowering than women biologically. They are just built that way. It's a fact. And children are obviously much less powerful and much less in control than their parents. Their parents control their living situation. They control, everything that happens to them. And abusers as well, even say if it is a man who is less physically overpowering, but what they tend to do is seek out partners that are insecure and easily manipulated. And they take away their sense of control by doing things like controlling finances, breaking them up from their friends, isolating them, taking away their independence, slowly breaking a person down, and then putting them in a situation where they are repeatedly exposed to something harmful and they can't control it. And then if I leave, I take it away, you're still going to be in that mindset of, I can't escape this now.
Yeah. And even in the idea of trafficking for children, the traffickers obviously don't care for the children, but they do give them care by giving them a place to sleep, giving them food. Like, those things make the children feel like, well, I need to go back there. That's how I eat for today. Right. Even though they know going back there is going to cause them serious physical, mental, psychological harm, they make that choice to do that. Well, I shouldn't say it that way. It's because it's not a choice, is it? Because their brain's almost forcing them into this type of thinking.
We'll talk about that a little bit later too, what happens to the brain. But I think what's really important to note here is that not everyone that has been abused as a kid or as a woman or a man experienced learned helplessness. It's not a necessity after abuse. It's not guaranteed. Some people do, some people don't. But those people that do experience learned helplessness are more likely to subsequently suffer with mental health issues following the abuse. Some people are much more mentally strong and are much more able to kind of cope following that abuse. But some people do develop learned helplessness. And as I said, that learned helplessness, it really becomes a catalyst for even more struggles later on. And it can lead to people putting themselves once again in another abusive relationship. We talk about this abuse cycle. People that have been, in abusive relationships in childhood are statistically more likely to be in abusive relationships later on, be it friendships, romantic relationships, or, mental relationships as well. And it's because of this learned helplessness.
Is there any purpose that learned helplessness can serve?
So that is a really interesting question, because I always ask myself, if there's anything that we see widely, you have to think, well, what purpose did it serve? How has this thing survived the test of evolution? If it serves no purpose, why do we see it among the species? Or is it an unwanted side effect of a different adaptive mechanism? Because a lot of the time, like we see with negative emotions, it's not that they serve an adaptive purpose, it's that something else does and they are a side effect. But the thing causing that thing promotes survival so much more that that side effect lingers. But from an evolutionary perspective, the concept of learned helplessness, it could seem counterintuitive. Why would I stay in something harmful when it reduces control and agency? But it's not that learned helplessness is considered adaptive in the traditional sense, that it serves our modern day motives, but it does serve a survival function. If we are in a dangerous scenario, and we spoke about this a little bit, if I'm going to escape, I might put myself in more harm than if I just sit back. So it could serve a purpose of conservation of energy. And we see this in both humans and in animals that have limited resources and limited energy. If they try and use that energy and those resources to escape, when escape is unlikely, well, it's going to cause death. So what they are going to do is try and reserve their energy and focus just on survival. And it goes back to that idea of, as human beings, we survive by any means necessary. And sometimes that means is suffering. We would rather suffer but survive than threaten our survival. So that's the idea of, why has this survived the test of evolution and why do we see it? But I think that it's a really important point, because it's a reminder that if we have got learned helplessness, we're not broken or damaged. It just means that it's a primitive instinct that has kicked in after a traumatic experience. And we just need to learn how to control it and heal from it. It's not that we are broken or anything's wrong. It's just a primal instinct.
And what doesn't make sense to me is, scientifically, like if something's there for us, you would think that it would happen all the time. Like this is the way it would work. Like somebody experiences this, 1 + 1 is always 2, but it's not. Like you said moments ago, Some people can go through trauma as children and they become stronger, or it motivates them to not be that way or make change or whatever it is, and they don't experience this. So why is it that only some people develop learned helplessness when going through traumatic situations?
This is one of the questions more broadly that really got me interested in psychology, because we have all these concepts that we can apply to lots of people, but not to everybody. How does some things apply to most people, but not everybody? And the answer is as complicated and simple as we are complicated. We have universal characteristics and traits, but we are also unique individuals with our own psychopathy, with our own, personalities and interactions and experiences, and those belief systems, those experiences, our education, our friendships, what was our relationship like with our parents? Did we have a teacher to rely on? Did we have any other support systems? All of these things work together to create who we are. And then they can make us even more vulnerable or protected against certain things. So it's not just as simple as anybody that experiences it is going to have the same effect, because none of us are exactly the same. We are all so similar in some respects, like we have the same brain function, we have the same areas of the brain, of course we do, but our connections are unique to us, just as our fingerprint is unique to us. But there are factors that do increase the risk. And probably the biggest one and the most highly supported one is this idea of locus of control. So how in control of our circumstances and the outcomes of our behavior are we? So people with an internal locus of control are people that believe that I am in control of what happens to me. My behavior is directly linked to the outcome of my behavior. I am independently in control of what happens. People with an external locus of control believe more in external factors like luck and fate, and are more likely to be religious and believe that something else has an influence over life's outcomes. And people who have an external locus of control, because they don't have so much of a grip of, I am in full control, they are more likely to suffer with learned helplessness because of kind of that passing over, I don't want to say responsibility, but passing over control of what happens to me to something else, be it fate, be it luck, be it a God, be it whatever you personally believe in, but it does increase the risk factor of developing learned helplessness.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. So if we just boil it down, that someone who's going through this, even if they all have the same amount of control, but you feel you feel that you have that control.
Yeah.
I had a friend who grew up in an abusive household, and he took control by laughing at his parents when they would abuse him. And I thought, you're nuts. Like, what the heck? What's wrong with you? Right. But for him, that was his way of saying, like, you can't affect me. You can't hurt me. Right. Like, what you're doing doesn't even bother me. It doesn't faze me at all. Right. So that to me was interesting. And now he's a, fully functioning. I mean, I'm not in his brain, but he's not in abusive relationships. That would be terrifying, but he's not in abusive relationships. He seems like a pretty solid guy. He is religious and has faith. So it's interesting to look at that and say, but that was his method of taking control back. And I remember being a kid thinking, you are just crazy, man. Like, every time you do that, they get worse. Like they treat you worse, but he took the control back by doing that.
No, I spoke about this topic in a blog for the ILF. So that I have a new blog column called The Doctor's Corner for the Innocent Lives Foundation, and every 2 to 3 weeks, I write about a different topic in psychology. And I talked about hypersexuality after sexual abuse, and it's not one typically considered, and it's not one that people think about, that the idea that after someone has been abused at whatever age, we think that they will refrain from sex because of the trauma. But actually what can happen, and it's because of this sense of control, they believe that now every person is a threat to them. So say a woman has been abused and now there's a man that, wants something from her. She now sees him as a threat, or she would see any man as a threat, because if I don't give you sex, you're just going to take it from me. And that it's obviously flawed and maladaptive thinking. To someone who has been through trauma, that can be the only thing that they think, and that can be very terrifying. So the only way of regaining control is to give it to you. So even if you don't ask for it now, I'm going to anybody that wants sex from me, because I don't want you to take it from me. My control is to give it to you. And for individuals who are suffering, that can give a false sense of control, because you are losing control by doing that, but it can give you a false sense of control. And it really does come from this learned helplessness. They have learned that they are not safe in their own body. They have learned that they are helpless to the desires of other people that want something from them. And it does really boil down to this: who is in control of me? Who is in control of my safety? Is it you? Is it me? Is it anybody that wants it? And especially if that comes from someone that you love, because we know who to be scared of. It's the people hiding in alleys, and it's the people in the dark, and it's the man under the bed. We know who to be afraid of. But if that's a partner or a friend or a parent, somebody who provides us love, someone who protects us, well, now who protects us? Because my sense of safety is threatened by my sense of harm. The same person that gives me safety is the same person that hurts me.
Yeah.
That is a very confusing thing to now deal with. So this idea of control just gets very confused. And when we think about it that way, now when we go back and say, well, why did they stay in that abusive relationship? Well, it makes sense because to them, the alternative is much scarier and much more harmful. So for them, my sense of control is not putting myself in further harm.
Okay, so this is all the big scary stuff, right? I mean, it's a pretty deep and heavy topic, and we are not nearly as jokey as we normally are on this podcast. No. So if someone listening to this either is dealing with this themselves or they know somebody who is, are there any strategies that we can talk about that can help someone learn to cope with this, or even, I don't want to say fix, that's the wrong term. What am I trying to say? Like get out of that situation or
heal?
Yeah, heal. Yeah,
heal
that's a good
a good word.
Yeah.
I also just remembered I didn't mention about the brain. I said that we would briefly comment on what happens. When it comes to learned helplessness, I think a lot of people don't think that it's real. They just think that it means that someone is weak-minded. They can't get themselves out of that situation. But being exposed to repeated events that we can't control, it changes the neuroplasticity of the brain. The idea neuroplasticity is the ability to, create new connections, grow memories and things like that. It actually reduces that ability. And what it can do as well is it can affect the prefrontal cortex, which is our executive functioning and decision making. And that has been linked to learned helplessness. So the increased stress because of that uncontrollable event can lead to reduction in the brain areas that control cognitive flexibility and attention and problem solving. So biologically, it's affecting that ability to think about an escape route. So it's not just grounded in psychology, it's grounded in biology too. But
and that's kind of limited to, like, we had this discussion. Well, actually, I wrote about it. You helped me with it, but it was a blog I wrote about stress. And that, it creates our brain it stops our brain from creating more like gray matter, right? And so is this the same kind of process that happens?
Yeah. So because learned helplessness, it's that we have a stressful situation that continuously occurs that we can't control. So that increased stress, it majorly affects our brain development. And if we have that experience when we're early in our life, while our brain is still in development, our prefrontal cortex is not fully developed until 25. And that is the executive functioning. So if we are repeatedly exposed to stress while our brain is in critical development, of course, it's going to lead to a reduction in connections. Of course, it's going to lead to a reduction in our ability to think about how to control our situations. So, and I think that's a really, really important point. And I would advise people to go and read your blog and my blog as well, two different areas of the same topic.
I think that's really good about the ILS. So we can add that actually in the beginning for announcements. So if people, when you go to the website, if you want to find the blog section, and then you can see Abbie's column there, which will be growing every couple weeks.
Yes.
Okay. So I'm glad we covered that because you did say we were going to do that and I completely forgot. Now let's talk about these coping or healing techniques.
So if we think that, it's biological, like we just said, that means it's set in stone. But it's not, because our psychology can change our biology.
Thank
we
God.
know that the beauty about the brain is that...
Right now, seriously, because there's some things up here that I didn't want to have for the rest of my life. So,
well, Chris, I think maybe you need a bit of extra work.
I do. I am not denying that.
But we can change. We can change the connections and we can improve and grow. And there are studies and there is a lot of evidence that we can definitely help people with learned helplessness. For example, studies that focus on empowerment, particularly because learned helplessness is more likely to occur in women, and it is very much linked to low self-esteem, because I don't believe I'm good enough to escape, or I don't believe I have the ability, and low self-efficacy also. So when we focus on therapy that increases self-efficacy and self-esteem, by proxy, it can help us with learned helplessness, because it helps us to kind of regain control and belief in ourselves. And that, like I said, by proxy can help us with learned helplessness. There's also some really interesting research that says that exercise and regular exercise can actually help with learned helplessness.
Really?
Yeah, and it's not just that idea of like, I exercise so I feel good, so, it makes me feel better. Well, actually, when we exercise, we release BDNF, which is brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which basically is a neurotrophin that maintains the health and plasticity of our neurons even. And this basically means it's a family of proteins that help the survival of our neurons. So the survival and functioning of our neurons. And that increases when we exercise. So we talk about the effects on the brain and reduction in neuroplasticity. Well, exercise increases our ability to have neuroplasticity. So we could potentially counteract the effects. And BDNF supports long-term memory. It also increases cognitive functioning, which are two things that we said can be affected in the brain because of the prefrontal cortex. And exercise also has antidepressant effects, which we know that poor mental health does increase the likelihood of one, getting learned helplessness, and then the reverse effect is true also. Learned helplessness increases the effect or likelihood of getting poor mental health. So it's not a, direct correlation between exercise and, protection from learned helplessness, but it is a positive nudging factor that should also be considered. And then other coping strategies would be things that target mental health, poor mental health, again, because it is a factor that increases the likelihood of getting learned helplessness. Things that help to treat, for example, major depressive disorder, which is strongly correlated with learned helplessness. Those, again, can help by proxy. So training people in, resilience and social support, and identifying how to get control over their life, how they can control their own finances, how they can control their resources, how they can control themselves, again, through exercise. These things that give people a sense of personal identity and control within themselves, that is really going to help with learned helplessness, because it is all about that control.
Yeah, it makes sense thinking about it, right? That we have, that when you work out, you exercise, that you are doing something good for yourself and you're controlling that. So if what affects learned helplessness and helps heal is gaining control over something, that makes a lot of sense that taking that control back into your life will help you heal. It's interesting.
And then the biological effects are kind of like just an added bonus, that it helps the brain too. But we underestimate the effects of things like diet and exercise. And they really do have such a strong effect because they're part of our daily routines. They're part of the way that we look after ourselves. They're part of the way that our brain functions and our body functions and our mood and our emotions. So these small things that we absolutely can control, those things will help. Those things will definitely help give us a sense of control over ourselves. But if we're looking for like a strategic therapeutic method, there is a recovery program called the Trauma Recovery and Empowerment Model that has been shown to be really, really effective. And I won't pretend to understand what goes into that model or what goes into that therapy, as that would be a clinician's job. But there are programs specifically developed to help people be empowered and gain control and help recover from learned helplessness.
That's great. That's nice too. It's a nice suggestion. Wow. Well, this was a heavy topic you chose for today. But
I like to mix it up.
Yeah, I think it's important though. I mean, in this world, there probably are more than a handful of, or hundreds or a large percentage of people who would be hearing this podcast that either know somebody or themselves are dealing with traumatic events.
Yeah.
So if this can help even one person, to me, that's amazing, right? If we can help even one person and help them find some type of answer or path to cope, then we've done a good job, right?
And to encourage open dialogue, because I think a lot of people don't realize that they're suffering when they're suffering, because our everyday is our reality. So if some of the things that we have been saying have kind of hit home in a way that you didn't really think about beforehand, that's what these courses and these podcasts are designed to do. They're designed to make you think and realize, because sometimes we don't. And it's so important to have these open conversations. These aren't issues that should be ignored because they're heavy, which is why Chris and I, we throw them into our podcasts, because we shouldn't ignore them because they are heavy. We should talk about them. We should have open dialogues about them. And we encourage you to have open dialogues about them.
Yeah. And if there are other topics that you're interested in hearing on this podcast that you think we can add some value to, please send them in or put them in the comments in whatever platform you're viewing this or listening to this. And we will take those things into consideration. You can also, email them in too, and we'll get those suggestions over to Abbie, and we'll add them into our list. Thanks. And again, as always, everybody, Abbie has provided a very lengthy list of research papers that we'll put in the show notes. So if anyone's interested in reading some of the research that was used to base our discussion today, it will all be there for you. And then next month, what are we talking about then?
We have another change of topic next
Good.
And we are talking about con artists.
Okay. That's going to be a fun one.
Mm-hmm.
That's a fun one, I think. It will be interesting, especially because you always bring the psychological elements into it.
Yep.
And I'm always talking about them from a social engineering angle, so this will be a really great discussion. Well, everyone, thank you for joining us this month on the Doctor is In of the Social Engineer podcast. Until next month, please stay safe. See you then.